Today we are going to talk about boundaries. And that is a really hot button word. A lot of us have strong reactions to the topic of boundaries, whether that's good or bad. But in my experience, it often leans toward a little bit of a cringe because we know that our boundaries might not be as strong as they could be, should be, or might be helpful if they were. And today, on the Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders podcast, it is my goal not to solve every problem you might have with boundaries, but to expand our thinking about the different areas in life where it is not only helpful to have good and healthy boundaries, but it's ultimately necessary and biblical. So I think this will be a really helpful conversation, yes, for the people in your ministry who undoubtedly, many of them are struggling with boundaries, but maybe most importantly, a helpful conversation for you and for me, because we all need reminders of what is good and true and right. So welcome. I am so glad that you are here listening to this episode of Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders. My name is Jessica Hayes, and I am a licensed counselor and licensed marriage and family therapist in South Carolina. And I'm the director at iHope Christian Care and Counseling. And the iHope Center is sponsoring this podcast because we have a mission to not only provide direct counseling and life coaching services to people in need, but to build up God's kingdom by equipping and encouraging the people on the front lines of mental health care, relationship care, counseling care, pastoral care, and that includes Christian leaders of every kind. So the goal with this podcast is that today you'll walk away with some equipping, some ideas and tools and resources in the area of boundaries, and hopefully some encouragement as well. Because the reality of church life, ministry work is that it is hard. The burnout rates are incredibly high for pastors and people in leadership positions in the church. And there's many reasons that we could talk about for burnout in general, but one of the big ones is boundaries. And so, as I said, my goal today is that we will expand our thinking a little bit about what boundaries can include and how it can look in real life as a pastor, as a Bible study leader, as a mom or a dad or a friend, whoever it is that you are trying to care for. So as we jump into this conversation, when I say boundaries, in my experience as a counselor, most people lean toward one of three areas. Like our mind automatically jumps to physical boundaries. We all can tell a story of a scandal in the church and someone whose ministry fell apart because of inappropriate or really lack of appropriate physical boundaries. But we also might automatically start thinking about our time and our schedule, this idea of workaholism. We're married to the ministry, except, oh yeah, we've got that spouse at home that we also stood before God and said, we're going to care for this person and spend our lives sacrificing for them. So a lot of us jump to these automatic thoughts around physical intimacy and the boundaries there, our time and our schedule, and what are we saying no to, and that area of boundaries. And the third area that sometimes people will jump to is thinking about boundaries when it comes to their heart, the things that they are thinking about, and just when we start to recognize how easily we can be influenced by the world around us, the cultural messages around us. And that might be kind of a higher level of thinking around boundaries, not because it's more important or more spiritual or something like that, but because we often don't think about that part of boundaries until we're noticing a negative impact on ourselves or someone else. When we start to notice that someone is talking in those common cultural cliches that aren't actually biblical. And so I want to touch on all three of these areas today as we consider what boundaries can and I would propose should look like for pastors and other Christian ministry leaders. So let's start with those physical boundaries. And now, obviously, the scriptures are very clear about intimacy and what that looks like. But sometimes we don't think about physical boundaries as far as even platonic touch and just how we're using our bodies to engage in ministry. And what I mean by that is that, it's very common in ministry to give hugs. And you can talk about, well, is it a side hug or a full-on hug? Should we do a high five or a fist bump instead of a hug? But in general, all of those would fall in the category of physical boundaries. It is worth thinking ahead of time about what boundaries you are comfortable with people of the same gender or the opposite gender. What about with kids? What about with someone who is really struggling versus someone who's not? When is it okay to give a hug or to offer something like that? And I don't mean that we need black and white, hard and fast rules. But if you haven't thought about it, it's likely that you're going to find yourself in some situations where someone tries to reach out to you and you might cringe or you might back away. You haven't really thought about it. You're just reacting. That's going to hurt that person's feelings. That's going to hurt the ministry in that moment. But also we find ourselves sometimes kind of going along with the crowd, and we can let our physical decisions be led more by our emotions rather than what is biblical and good and true. So yes, absolutely, physical boundaries has to include intimacy and what lines cannot and absolutely cannot be crossed in certain relationships, but also thinking bigger picture than that. What sort of physical touch are you comfortable with people in your ministry? And recognizing they might have different boundaries than you have. If you're counseling or sitting down and pastoring and trying to meet with someone who is struggling in their marriage, their physical touch, physical boundaries might need to be different than somebody who is struggling with anxiety or dealing with something else. Again, kids versus adults, and just thinking through possible scenarios. But I'll also mention in the area of physical boundaries that sometimes in ministry, we can get overwhelmed by the needs of the people who we're serving. And some of us carry that stress physically. And we can start to really shut down. We can have psychosomatic symptoms, stomach aches, headaches, difficulty sleeping, tightness in our body. And so just being aware of, is your physical body carrying stress or struggling or having some kind of reaction, maybe overreaction to the ministry work that you're doing, and putting boundaries in place to protect your own health, your own body that God has given you. But let's also take a few minutes and talk about our time and our schedule and that kind of almost more logistical side of boundaries. The number one thing that I want to highlight here, because I'm talking to pastors, I'm talking to ministry leaders, is that when you're saying yes to something, by default, you're saying no to something else. And it's very easy to say yes to church-related, God-related things. People genuinely need you. They need help. Every volunteer committee would love to have more volunteers. And when you're in a leadership position, of course, we need to serve and lead sacrificially. But you cannot save your ministry, your church, the people in your church. You cannot be um, the hinge that everything is going to turn on, that is the Lord's responsibility and His alone. And a lot of people in leadership positions, especially in the church, we tend to start taking things on our own shoulders. And maybe that's because we're passionate about it. Maybe it's because no one else said yes, but we think it's really important. And we start to forget that if I'm saying yes to this, by default, I am absolutely saying no to something else. You might be saying no to making it home for dinner with your family. You're not saying no, you're just making that phone call or sending that text saying, shoot, I'm running late. I'm sorry, I'm not going to make it again. You might be saying no to going to your kid's soccer game. You might be saying no to working out or getting a reasonable amount of sleep at night. You might be saying no to yourself and your own health. Or you might just be saying no to volunteer opportunity B because you've already committed yourself to A, plus probably F and M and Z. And, only on weekends you're going to do dumb or D. Like you're overcommitted. And then when a new opportunity comes along, you can't do it, even though maybe that really is the sweet spot for your skills or your passions. And then the third area I want to highlight today, and I will say our next episode of this podcast, whether you're watching or listening or reading the blog, the next episode will be more of the how-to, practical. How do I say no to someone? How do I figure out where I'm comfortable or not comfortable with my boundaries? We're just trying to expand our thinking about it today. And the third area that I want to hit on before we close is those emotional or even intellectual boundaries. And I think here particularly about Romans chapter 12, verse 2, which tells us, do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It is so easy to be influenced by the world, the books we read, the podcasts we listen to, the TV shows we watch, the music we listen to, the people that we get coffee with, especially if we're in ministry and we're reaching out to people who are lost, or we're leading a church and we're trying to gain wisdom from business books and leadership books and time management podcasts, and we're meeting with leaders in our community who can mentor us, and all of these things might have wisdom. They might offer good things, but they are not necessarily offering God's wisdom. They are not necessarily building up a church. They might be building up a business. Yeah, the church deals with money, God's money. It's a very different organization. And so being aware of who are you listening to? Who are you letting influence you? And that's not just in our leadership capacity. That might be in your marriage. That might be in your parenting. I mean, I'm a marriage and family therapist. There are some great resources out there for marriage, for parenting, offering skills and ideas and equipping. And you can go on any social media platform and find millions upon millions of ideas and influencers. And some of them offer wisdom and plenty of them don't. But it sounds good. And it hits often on our feelings or our temptations. And when we're tired and we're stressed and we're worried and we're busy, it's easy to let things influence us in ways we never thought they would. And so being aware of who is influencing you, who are you paying attention to, and do you have healthy and appropriate boundaries around not only what you are listening to, watching, engaging, but how you're managing and responding to and evaluating that information. So those are a few ideas for us all to consider around physical and time and emotions when it comes to boundaries. Again, recognizing that burnout is real and it is not God's good and right plan for you. We'll talk next episode around the how-to, the practical tips, and I know that will be really helpful for you. But while you're waiting for next week's episode, I would invite you to consider, first and foremost, especially if you're local to South Carolina, head over to ihopeflorence.com and take a look at the services that we offer at the iHope Center. Consider making a donation to support our ministry. We keep our client fees at 50% below the local average cost of counseling, not because we magically have lower expenses, but because we trust that God will provide donations and church support to help offset all of that. And so if you're in South Carolina, we invite you to consider our services, consider a donation, and wherever you're at, whoever you are, whatever church you're at, I'm glad that you're here. And I hope you will subscribe to the show. I hope you'll share it with a friend. And I hope you'll come back next week for some practical ideas around how to actually implement and follow through on some of the boundaries that we were talking about today. So I will sign off for now. Again, this is the Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders podcast, sponsored by iHope Christian Care and Counseling in South Carolina. I'm glad you're here, and I'll talk to you next week.